King Charles makes his final decision to hand over the monarchy to Prince William as he becomes weak batting cancer, but Queen Camilla is jealous and unhappy about the decision. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. The news came quietly, almost as if the palace itself was reluctant to deliver it. A small, discreet envelope arrived that morning, placed carefully on Charles's desk by a nurse who had served the royal family for decades. It contained test results, clinical in tone yet devastating in implication. Charles had known for months that the cancer he had been fighting was aggressive, that his strength was waning, and that the disease might outpace even the most determined treatments. Yet seeing the words in black and white brought a wave of reality so intense it stole his breath. This was no longer a private battle. It was a turning point, one that demanded not just medical attention but emotional fortitude, strategic thinking, and a confrontation with the inevitable question every monarch must eventually face: who will inherit the crown when the king can no longer serve? As he sat in his private study, the sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains, Charles allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. His mind drifted through decades of public service, from the ceremonial duties of youth to the nuanced responsibilities of king, and now, the personal battle that could redefine the monarchy. Illness had a way of stripping away pretenses, leaving only raw truth. He felt fear, not just for himself, but for the institution he had devoted his life to protecting. Every decision he had made had been guided by duty and love, yet none felt more critical, or more personal, than the one looming before him. Camilla, ever attuned to his moods, sensed the weight of this moment immediately. She approached quietly, her presence a mixture of comfort and silent questioning. Her own emotions were complex. She had spent years navigating the scrutiny of the public eye, defending her place beside Charles while the world judged, whispered, and speculated. Now, she faced a new reality. The king she had stood by for decades was vulnerable in ways the world rarely saw, and that vulnerability carried consequences that extended far beyond their private lives. She knew that the coming weeks would test her loyalty, her patience, and the delicate balance of influence she had worked to maintain. Charles had always been a man of meticulous thought. He weighed every decision carefully, considering the implications for his family, his kingdom, and his legacy. Yet now, faced with the stark truth of his mortality, he recognized that some decisions could no longer be postponed. The transition of power was no longer a distant event, something to be planned over years. It was imminent, pressing, unavoidable. William, his eldest son, was ready in many ways, trained for the responsibilities that would soon fall upon him, but readiness alone could not account for the emotional complexity of assuming leadership while the father who had shaped him remained alive but frail. The diagnosis itself was devastating, but it also clarified the path ahead. Charles realized that postponing the transfer of authority could risk both the stability of the monarchy and the well-being of his family. Every day he delayed, the potential for misunderstanding, resentment, and emotional strain grew. The king's mind, usually so sharp and decisive, now wrestled with a dual burden: the physical limitations imposed by illness and the emotional weight of making a decision that could alter the lives of those he loved most. Medical experts were consulted immediately. The palace physician, a figure of calm authority, explained the prognosis in precise terms, outlining treatment options, expected outcomes, and potential complications. Charles listened attentively, absorbing every word, yet his thoughts frequently drifted to the personal ramifications rather than the clinical ones. The illness was not just a private struggle, it was a fulcrum upon which the future of the monarchy would pivot. Every choice would reverberate through history, influencing not just policy and public perception but the very dynamics of a family bound by duty, love, and legacy. Camilla, present throughout these discussions, displayed a careful balance of concern and composure. She asked pertinent questions, sought clarity on procedures and outcomes, yet beneath her poised exterior, the undercurrent of personal stakes ran deep. She understood that Charles's health crisis was not merely a medical issue, it was a signal that the balance of influence, affection, and power within the palace was about to shift. Her mind, trained by decades of navigating complex social and political landscapes, immediately assessed the consequences, both public and private, of the decisions that were now inevitable. In the following days, Charles began to reflect on the broader implications of his diagnosis. He thought about William's future, the expectations of the public, and the historical precedents set by previous monarchs. Every detail mattered. How the transition would be communicated, how responsibilities would be delegated, and how the emotional well-being of his family could be preserved amid public scrutiny. The king understood that leadership was not only about making decisions in the present but about anticipating the ripples those decisions would create decades into the future. The diagnosis also prompted introspection. Charles contemplated the legacy he would leave behind, not just as a monarch but as a father and a husband. He thought about his relationship with Camilla, the sacrifices she had made, and the delicate threads of love and loyalty that had sustained them both through public controversy and personal trials. He reflected on William, who had grown into a man of maturity, judgment, and dedication, yet whose journey into kingship would now be accelerated by circumstances beyond his control. The weight of history, duty, and personal emotion converged into a singular, pressing reality. The moment to decide had arrived. Even as he processed this truth, the palace continued its rhythm of ceremonial duties, public engagements, and administrative responsibilities. The world beyond Buckingham Palace remained unaware of the intimate, emotional storm brewing within its walls. While the public might read headlines about royal health or speculate on succession, they could not grasp the profound mixture of fear, anticipation, and responsibility that defined the king's daily life. Every handshake, every speech, every appearance was now layered with the knowledge that the king was navigating not only the demands of his role but also the fragility of his own existence. Charles also faced the delicate task of balancing transparency with dignity. While the public deserved honesty about the health of their monarch, the nuances of his personal struggle, the emotions of his family, and the private negotiations surrounding succession had to remain shielded. He understood that revealing too much could spark panic, speculation, or resentment. Revealing too little could invite distrust and criticism. This tightrope, walked daily, amplified the emotional weight of the diagnosis and intensified the urgency of planning for the inevitable transition. Camilla, for her part, began to recognize the full magnitude of the challenge. Her role as partner, advisor, and confidant was now intertwined with a shifting dynamic that placed William more prominently in the line of influence. Though her devotion to Charles was genuine, the reality that her influence might wane was an uncomfortable truth. Her emotions were complex. Love for her husband, concern for his health, pride in William, and the lingering sting of personal jealousy. The human heart, even within the walls of power, is rarely simple, and Camilla's experience was no exception. By the end of the first week following the diagnosis, the contours of the path ahead were becoming clearer. Charles understood that the health crisis had accelerated the need for decisive action. The monarchy required stability, William required preparation, and Camilla required acknowledgement of her contributions and emotions. The king's mind, though burdened by illness, worked with a clarity sharpened by urgency. Every conversation, every meeting, every quiet reflection was now informed by the recognition that time was no longer abundant. The palace, often a place of tradition and predictability, had transformed into a space of tension, anticipation, and emotional negotiation. Every room, every corridor, every familiar piece of decor bore silent witness to the internal struggles of a family caught between love, duty, and history. Charles, aware of the weight of every moment, prepared to make decisions that would resonate far beyond the gilded walls, shaping not only the trajectory of the monarchy but the emotional landscape of his family for years to come. Camilla had long understood that her role in the monarchy was complex, fraught with scrutiny, and tempered by the delicate balance of public perception and private loyalty. Yet the events unfolding in Buckingham Palace now tested the limits of her composure in ways she had never anticipated. The diagnosis of Charles's illness had accelerated a shift in family dynamics, thrusting Prince William into the spotlight more intensely than ever. For Camilla, this was a double-edged sword. Pride in William's maturity and capability was entwined with the undeniable sting of jealousy, a gnawing awareness that her influence within the inner circles of power might be subtly diminishing. In private, she wrestled with these conflicting emotions. On one hand, she had stood steadfastly by Charles for decades, weathering public criticism, invasive media coverage, and whispers that had often questioned her legitimacy as queen consort. Her loyalty was unquestionable, and her devotion genuine. Yet, as she observed William navigating his preparation for kingship, assuming responsibilities that had once been hers to advise upon, a quiet tension settled within her, a fear that her voice, once central to palace decisions, was beginning to fade. She began to notice subtle shifts in how advisors and staff approached her, the deference in their tone slightly altered when William was present, the nuances of influence slowly recalibrating in the changing landscape of authority. Camilla's unease was compounded by the optics of the public eye. The media, ever eager for narrative, framed William's increasing prominence as a natural, almost predestined rise. Headlines praised his readiness, his composure, and his seeming emotional intelligence, often juxtaposing these traits with Charles's frailty. Though never overtly disrespectful to her, the media's portrayal subtly cast Camilla as an observer rather than a participant, a figure of tradition slowly eclipsed by the next generation. These narratives, however measured, were enough to fuel her anxieties, stirring questions that she struggled to answer. Would her decades of loyalty be acknowledged? Would her position remain secure? Would she still be seen as a pivotal presence, or merely as a supporting figure in the story of succession? Within the palace walls, the tension was tangible. Camilla moved through corridors with her usual elegance, yet there was an edge to her interactions. Small gestures, an uncharacteristic pause before speaking, a subtle tightening of her posture, a glance that lingered longer than necessary, betrayed the storm of emotions she sought to conceal. The staff noticed, of course, but remained discreet, understanding that her composure was vital not only for Charles's morale but also for the stability of the household. Courtiers speculated privately about her mood, whispering that jealousy might be at play, but no one could truly know the complexity of her internal struggle, nor the depth of her affection for Charles despite it. Her unease extended beyond mere personal insecurity. Camilla understood, acutely, the strategic realities of the monarchy. William's increasing public profile, his deeper involvement in decisions, and the rapid acceleration of his preparation for kingship were all necessary responses to Charles's health crisis. Yet they also signaled a reallocation of influence within the palace, a shift that placed her in a position of subtle disadvantage. Every meeting she attended, every discussion with advisors, carried the implicit reminder that the balance of power was evolving. Even in her quiet moments, she reflected on her role, how to maintain relevance, how to assert influence without appearing overbearing, and how to navigate the emotional landscape of a family under pressure. Camilla's internal dialogue often circled back to one central tension: loyalty versus ambition. She loved Charles deeply and had invested decades of her life in supporting him, yet she also desired recognition, authority, and the sense of security that comes from being integral to decisions of consequence. This was not selfishness, she reminded herself, but an instinct to protect her place, her legacy, and her dignity. The palace, while a bastion of tradition, was also a theater of subtle negotiation, where influence was measured in words, gestures, and quiet counsel. Camilla knew that navigating this terrain required vigilance, emotional intelligence, and sometimes, restraint that tested the very limits of her patience. Even small interactions with William carried weight. She observed the way he carried himself, the careful consideration he gave to advisors, suggestions, and the respect he showed for his father's legacy. She admired him, truly, yet she also felt a pang of displacement. Where once she might have been consulted first or had her opinion carry unquestioned weight, she now found herself negotiating for influence alongside a son poised to inherit a role of unprecedented significance. These dynamics, subtle as they were, compounded her unease, creating a swirl of emotion that was impossible to ignore. Complicating matters further was the awareness that Charles himself was navigating his own vulnerability. He depended on her for emotional support, for counsel, and for the steady presence that had always been his anchor. Yet her support had to be calibrated, balanced delicately between encouragement and the restraint necessary to avoid influencing decisions that could appear self-serving. Every conversation with Charles required precision, both in tone and content. Her emotions, no matter how intense, could not be allowed to distort the reality of the situation. Outside the private walls, the media offered constant reminders of her visibility and the subtle scrutiny that came with it. Photographs of her in public, attending events, or offering a consoling smile to Charles, were dissected and analyzed. Social commentary, though often veiled, frequently focused on her role in the succession narrative, questioning her influence and speculating about her reactions to William's growing prominence. These public pressures reinforced the private tension, making every decision, every glance, and every word a carefully measured act in a larger performance she could never fully escape. In moments of solitude, Camilla wrestled with the emotional duality of her situation. She loved Charles, yet she feared being overshadowed. She felt pride in William's readiness, yet she could not suppress the instinctive longing for recognition and influence. Her mind oscillated between loyalty, fear, pride, and envy, each emotion influencing her actions in subtle but significant ways. It was a delicate psychological balancing act, one that demanded constant self-awareness, reflection, and emotional discipline. As the days unfolded, Camilla's unease became intertwined with a growing sense of urgency. The transition was no longer a distant consideration, it was imminent. William's preparation, Charles's declining health, and the subtle shifts in palace dynamics all converged to create a pressure cooker environment. Camilla realized that how she navigated these coming weeks would define not only her role within the family but also her public perception, her legacy, and her emotional well-being. Every interaction, every decision, every conversation would be a test of composure, strategy, and emotional fortitude. Despite the tension, Camilla maintained her outward composure. She continued to attend official engagements, offering support to Charles, observing William's growth, and managing her own emotions with a careful blend of grace and strategic calculation. Yet beneath this poised exterior, the emotional undercurrent remained strong, an invisible storm of jealousy, fear, and concern that shaped her every thought. She understood that the coming weeks would be pivotal, not only for the monarchy but for her own place within it. The challenge was immense: to remain both loyal and influential, to support Charles and William while preserving her own dignity and relevance, and to navigate a delicate balance of emotion and strategy in a household where every nuance carried weight. In these moments, Camilla realized a profound truth: power is never solely about position. It is also about perception, influence, and the subtle interplay of human emotion. Even within the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, where protocol and tradition dictate behavior, the human heart remains a force both unpredictable and consequential. Her unease was a reminder of this truth, a reflection of the deeply human stakes behind every public gesture, every private decision, and every shift in the balance of the royal household. The days passed, each one intensifying her internal conflict. She observed William, she supported Charles, and she navigated the pressures of public life with the elegance and strategic awareness that had always defined her. Yet every step, every smile, and every interaction carried the unspoken weight of anticipation, anxiety, and unresolved emotion. Camilla's unease was not a fleeting moment, it was a persistent, underlying reality, shaping her experience of a palace caught between duty, loyalty, and the inexorable passage of time. The halls of Buckingham Palace, normally steeped in routine and ceremonial precision, now buzzed with a tension that was almost tangible. Every footstep, every whispered conversation, carried an undercurrent of anxiety. The news of King Charles's declining health had rippled through the royal household, sparking a quiet but pervasive turmoil among courtiers, aides, and advisors. For decades, these individuals had operated within a predictable hierarchy, understanding their roles, loyalties, and the subtle etiquette of palace life. Now, the very foundation of that structure was shifting, creating uncertainty that touched every corner of the court. Advisors convened in hushed meetings, their discussions marked by a combination of strategy, concern, and speculation. The king's health demanded immediate attention, yet it was only one element of the broader crisis. The monarchy itself, an institution built on continuity, tradition, and meticulous management of perception, now faced the delicate challenge of transitioning authority while maintaining stability. Every decision, every recommendation, carried weighty implications, not just for the royal family but for the public's confidence in the crown. The stakes were immense, and the pressure on each courtier intensified with each passing day. Rumors began to circulate, some whispered behind closed doors, others more boldly floated through the palace corridors. Questions abounded. How soon would Charles formally delegate responsibilities to William? Would Camilla's influence wane in the coming months? Were there factions forming within the court, subtly aligning themselves with one member of the family over another? The answers were neither simple nor readily apparent. In a palace where protocol often masked personal ambition, the line between loyalty and self-interest was thin, and the slightest misstep could trigger consequences that reverberated far beyond the palace walls. The courtiers, many of whom had served multiple generations of the royal family, understood the gravity of the moment. Loyalty to the king was paramount, yet the practicalities of succession demanded foresight, initiative, and sometimes difficult compromises. Long-standing alliances within the court began to show signs of strain. Those who had historically advised Charles now had to consider how their counsel might influence William's preparation, as well as how Camilla would perceive any shifts in favor or attention. Even the most disciplined staff felt the subtle pressures of divided loyalties, caught between reverence for the king and the pragmatic realities of a monarchy in transition. Communication within the court took on new urgency. Private briefings, discreet meetings, and carefully timed updates became the norm. Every aide understood that information was both a tool and a liability. Leaks could inflame public speculation, miscommunication could erode trust, and even well-intentioned advice could be misinterpreted. The palace had always operated with precision, but now that precision required heightened awareness, vigilance, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. The dynamics of power were shifting, and each member of the court had to navigate them carefully, lest they find themselves on the wrong side of influence or perception. Amid the turmoil, tensions between William and Camilla subtly intensified. Their interactions, though outwardly polite, carried layers of unspoken emotion. Camilla's unease, rooted in concern, jealousy, and a desire to maintain relevance, intersected with William's growing confidence and emerging authority. Every conversation about protocol, scheduling, or ceremonial responsibility became a subtle negotiation of influence. Courtiers observed these interactions keenly, interpreting gestures and words for signs of shifting loyalties. Even the smallest expressions, a raised eyebrow, a pause before responding, a carefully chosen word, were analyzed for meaning, carrying far more significance than